Well, I really firmly believe that we at the campus are gifted with we're blessed with very gifted teachers. And I am excited today to tell you that we have someone who's going to be with us who I believe, as a member of our congregation, actually brings quite a lot to our teaching team. And so this morning we're going to hear from J.D. MacGillivray, and some of you will know J.D. J.D. is a member who normally attends our Bathurst location, but he's married to Trish, and they're sitting up front here. They have 3 adult kids. He runs a successful paint business, and in his spare time, he teaches the Word. And he's been a part-time teaching pastor at several churches. He's been an elder in a number of churches, including one of Laird's other churches. And he's a graduate from Dallas Theological Seminary. And we are really blessed to have him here with us. And I really firmly believe that he's going to add quite a lot to our teaching team. And we're really excited and blessed to have him here with us. And so would you please give a very warm welcome to JD as he comes and delivers the word to us this morning. So thank you very much, JD.
Thank you. I feel after that music intro, I need to work a yo-yo into some part of this message. I'll work on that. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be back. I think I was here around New Year's or a little bit into the new year last year. I'm 61, so I could forget whether I was here or not. But anyway, I want to talk to you this morning about an issue which is uncomfortable. And Jesus was all about surfacing things that were uncomfortable and changing things up. And as we go through this passage, the goal is to think about how we can live differently. Now, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say that the society that we live in is obsessed with sex. I was thinking if you lived in Ireland, it would be a society that's obsessed with potatoes. And if you are a hockey fan, perhaps you'd say Canada is obsessed with hockey. But we live in a culture that we are being bombarded wherever we look. You go to a doctor's office, you open a magazine, or you're at the dentist's office, you are exposed to advertising that isn't there to sell tires. It's there to sell sex, and by way move you to directions that you don't want to be in. If you go to the mall, if you enter the south entrance, Davis Drive, and you move a few steps inside, you will see larger-than-life women in pictures with larger-than-life hair, and you're bombarded constantly. You can't turn on a TV, you can't turn on your computer, you can't move your mouse without the opportunity very quickly to be exposed and pushed in directions that we know really aren't helpful. The passage that we're going to speak on today is we're sort of out of sequence because of the fake ice storm that we had last week that allowed everybody to sleep in. So Rob is really going to go back next week, but I was already slated, and so I'm going to go forward. But Jesus comes to a passage in the Sermon on the Mount, and in a very few short words, he takes the thinking of the day and he completely flips it upside down. And in so doing, he calls his audience of that day, and then by extension, all of us who have the written word, he calls us, and as he called them, to live differently. So if you have your Bibles, I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 5. And if you don't have your Bibles, I'm sure behind me there's a screen that is magically going to put up some verses, but I will read them with you. Beginning in verse 27 of Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, what I want to communicate to you this morning is that Jesus is entering a section in this passage as he's gathered his people, first of all, his disciples, not just the 12. These were people that were considered in his core, so it would have been many, many more people. And as time went on, as he spoke, and some would say he was speaking on the hillside near the Sea of Galilee. At any rate, there were farmers who had laid down their tools. There were housewives who put aside their all that they were doing, and fishermen. They were all gathered there to listen to this great teacher who had performed many miracles. And he had a very captive audience, and he began to say things. And in this particular section, he comes at it, and as you're going to see over the weeks, 6 times Jesus introduces his topic, and he says, you have heard that it was said. And then he goes on and he says, but I say. And so last week, Rob should have been up here, and next week he's going to be talking about anger. And in that passage, beginning in verse 21, he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. And then he goes on, but I say to you, and then he carries on. And now in this passage, he keeps it going, and he's going to carry on with this repeated theme. You've heard it said, but I say. Now, what's he talking about? You have heard it said. Well, the 10 Commandments is what Jesus is referring to. He's going back to Exodus chapter 20, and he's addressing in the passage that we're going to talk about today, he's going to address the issue of adultery. It's not an issue that we like to talk about. It's certainly not an issue that we want to have a small group session and talk about it. But Jesus recognizes that this is a very, very important topic because it's moving into those things that can destroy homes, and can destroy families, can destroy trust, and can destroy and bring great, great sadness. Now, the first thing that I'd like you to recognize as Jesus brings this talk and carries on with this discussion is that the standard for righteousness that he's giving is much higher. There was a problem with the people, the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees especially, who considered righteousness as something that was demonstrated by all things external. And if you recall verse 20 of chapter 5, Jesus says, as he's speaking to this crowd, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The Pharisees were very vigilant about pointing out the rights and wrongs of other people. They were pompous, they were full of themselves, and they thought they had cornered the market on righteousness. That word means being in right standing with God. And their whole premise and the whole way that they operated and the whole way they communicated to everybody that was around them is that it's what you do on the outside that really counts. And Jesus, over the years that he was in ministry, pointed this out time and time again, that you may be right on the outside for everybody to see, but it's really what's inside that makes a difference. It's the matter of the heart. And I want to take you to Proverbs 4:23, and it says this: "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life." So the standard of righteousness that Jesus is promoting here is much higher than anything that the people had ever heard. You can imagine the crowd as he began this little section of his speech. "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery." And there were in the crowd a few people that said, "Amen. Preach it, brother." And then as he went on and he says, "But I say to you." And I was trying to imagine as I was sitting at my desk the people that were in the back. I mean, there's always people in the back. There's people in the back right now. I mean, back there by the door, there's two, I don't know what you call them, but they're back sitters. And then there's people that are in the front. But the guys in the back, they don't always hear so well. You can imagine as Jesus was speaking and he says, "You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery." And the guys in the back are going, did we hear that right? You mean to tell me that if we just look at a woman, we're guilty of adultery? I was talking to Dave Simpson just prior to this and was telling him that we're going to go to Florida on March break. My wife's a teacher, so we have to pay top dollar to go during March break, but it's worth it. We get there and go to the beach, watch the sunset, and occasionally if we're in a beach chair, and I've been to Florida many, many times, but there will be people walking by. And you can be sitting there, and the next thing you know, a thong goes by. And you're saying to yourself, "Man, I wish that guy would get some regular shorts." We're not guilty if we see a beautiful woman. But let me tell you, if you're coming from the north and you're going to Upper Canada Mall and you decide to enter into the south because there's things to see, you're moving in that area of lustful intent. I can't control the people that walk by me on the beach. I can't control the beautiful women. But I can control how long I linger and where I allow my mind to go. I'm amazed. I have a contracting company. I do painting. I do remodeling and carpentry. And with the onset of the internet and the ability to look at tools, it's just amazing. I mean, you can just spend a whole evening looking at stuff that you'd like to buy, looking at things that you'd like to convince your wife that you should have. And the other thing that happens is all sorts of sidebar things come up. Little ads for this. I never knew that you could be looking at a cordless drill and on this side of the screen, and then over here is a little banner for something entirely unrelated. But if I allow myself, I can click and go down paths that aren't great. Now, Jesus is saying to the people, it's possible to participate in adultery in the flesh. And adultery is having sex as a married person with someone that is not your spouse. That's what qualifies for adultery. And what Jesus is saying, it's the standard for righteousness is bigger. It's greater. It's higher. And it begins with your heart. So don't be afraid if a beautiful woman or a handsome man, and I got to say, Jesus is using men here, but it's equal opportunity. This is a passage, and I hope you women who read the Bible don't get discouraged from the fact that you're not included in everything. But please be included in this, because here's what I know. For every man who's involved in adultery, there's a woman. So if one man is having multiple affairs, that means there's multiple women. Keep that in mind. But also keep in mind that it is not a sin to observe or be confronted with something of beauty or something that is attractive. It's where you go, and that's where Jesus is saying it's about your heart. Righteousness begins in your heart, and what's in your heart flows out. So the standard of righteousness is higher, and then Jesus goes on and he says the solution to all of this is harder. Look what he says in verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. What Jesus is getting at here is you have to be ruthless. You have to be absolutely brutal with sin when it confronts you. You've got to shut it down. You've got to cut it out and cut it off. About 10 years ago, there was a movie, and I'm sure that some of you in this room saw it. It was a movie called 127 Hours. And it was a movie about a rock climber, mountaineer, adventurous guy named Aaron Ralston. And Aaron Ralston found himself in Utah in the mountains. And he was an adventurous young man. And after leaving a group that he was with, he went into the backcountry and at some point found himself between two mountain walls. I'm not describing it very well, but anyway, there were rock on one side and rock on the other, and as he was in there, a boulder rolled down and pinned him between the two rock faces. Rolled right on his arm. He did everything. I mean, everything. This guy was absolutely a pro at being in the outdoors, and he found himself wedged between two walls of rock, and that rock was on his arm. He tried to leverage the rock up. He tried to bang it. He did everything. He screamed and yelled for help, but he was way, way, way out there. And after days went by, he finally decided that his only option was to take his knife and start to surgically remove his arm. Somewhat graphic for Sunday morning, I know, but listen, what Jesus is calling his people in the day and us right now in this sexually saturated society that we live in, he's calling us to do radical surgery on sin. What would you do What does it mean to be radical if you're here as a Christian in 2020? I like to do research for the times when I speak, and I've been working with some guys lately, and I met with some friends a few weeks ago, and I was telling them what I was speaking on, and I just did a little reconnaissance and asked them, what does it mean to be radical with sin? 2020, January, I don't know if you carry on the tradition of making resolutions, but I've been thinking in my own private thoughts about what it means to live differently. This is the whole thrust of what Laird and the other guys that have been teaching have been moving through. It's just like, what will be different today? What will be different this month? What will be different this year if you were to live differently? What would that look like? And so I started asking the guys that I have been with, and one of the fellows just talked about his struggle with pornography. And that's a struggle that we don't really want to admit. It's sort of the elephant in the room, but if statistics are right, there's a lot of guys in these chairs right now in this room there are a lot of women. I mean, it's just not, I used to think it was a guy thing, but now as I read and try to figure all of this out, I'm seeing that a lot of women, it's just in a society where we're just bombarded constantly, and there's just a click away. I mean, you see something, and you click, and then it leads to something else, and you do another click, and then the next thing you know, you're right in there. And it's hard to scream for help when you're just buried. And so as I'm talking with these fellas, one of them, he just said, I got to the place where I just had to give it up. The internet was not even going to be open. I had another friend, guy that I was talking with, and he said to me, all my computer stuff and my phone, it's linked to work, so it's a no-brainer. If I go over here and look on the company phone or the company computer, I'm going to be busted, and it's not worth losing my job. But he said, I had an iPad that was connected to nobody. I mean, it was connected to Wi-Fi, but it was nobody could tell where he had been with that. And he said it was just too great a temptation. So, what did he do with that $600 iPad? He threw it out. He just put it in the garbage. He said, I'm not going to allow that to be a portal to get into places where I don't want to go. Now, here's the thing. You don't often think about adultery as being downstream to anything, but there's a lot of stuff that comes before adultery happens. You have a thought, and then that just goes a little bit further, and the next thing you know, you're having a lunch, or the next thing you know, you're laying out your day so that you're going to meet up at the same time. You're just going to happen to be in the hallway. You're just going to happen to be at the elevator at the same time. You happen to be in the same location. You happen to be at the same... You know what I'm talking about. And if you're not radical, if you're not willing to surgically remove these things, you're going to find that those upstream things make their way downstream, and the next thing you know, you're caught in it. Now, Jesus, he's trying to get the attention. He's realizing the people in the back row are not really paying that much attention. So he says, okay, here's what you got to do. You've got to gouge your eye out, and you got to cut your hand off. Back in the culture of the day, the right eye and the right hand, those were considered the best. So he's speaking in hyperbole. And the reason I know that he's speaking in hyperbole is, listen, what happens if I bring a screwdriver up here and I say, I've got a problem with lust, and so we're going to spend 5 minutes in this service, I'm going to pluck my eye out. So I stand there for a little while, and then I just go like that, pluck it out. Is that going to solve things? What if I showed up next week with a black patch here and Captain Hook right here? Could I still lust? Oh yeah. I got a left eye and I've got a left hand. Now if we had Stevie Wonder up here, totally blind, you know who Stevie Wonder, or am I dating myself, Very superstitious. That guy, he's blind, been blind for a long, I think from birth, I can't remember. Anyway, he's blind, he can't see people, but you know what? He would tell us that he has the capacity to lust. And all of us, even if we closed our eyes, we have an imagination, and what Jesus is saying is, he's not telling people to go and cut their eye out and cut off their hand. Although he's saying it here, it's hyperbole. He's trying to make a point. He's trying to say, listen, because here's the options that Jesus could have done. He could have said, if your right eye causes you to sin, go down to the corner store and get an eye patch. Just wear that. If your right hand causes you to, wear a glove. Those are the options that Jesus had, but he went further. And he was trying to give a picture of what it means to be absolutely ruthless. For some of us, we need to throw out the iPad. For some of us, we need to totally get controls on our computer. For some of us, we need to watch new TV shows. For some of us, it means way bigger things than that. I'm sure somewhere in some room this morning, somebody needs to go to their boss and ask for a transfer. How radical is that? There are some people somewhere in a service someplace that need to come home and tell their wife or tell the husband, honey, we need to move to a new neighborhood. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people who developed relationships with the neighbor. And the next thing you know, there's more development. And then over time, the marriage is over. And maybe there's a new one started, but there's wreckage all around. Jesus is saying, hey, you've heard it said you shall not commit adultery, but just to linger, it's wrong. Cut it out and cut it off. If you want to live differently this year, you've got to think about what's going on in your life. It may not even be this particular section. Jesus is going at bat 6 times. He's saying, you've heard it said, but I say to you, and next week, when Rob goes backwards, he's going to talk about anger and murder. And he's going to say, you've heard it said you shouldn't murder. You see, here's the thing. Everybody in this room is going to say, yeah, I know, shouldn't murder somebody. That is bad. That is so bad. Now, I was listening to a speaker talking about prison ministry that he had. And he would go in and talk with convicts, and he said there was just such a sliding scale with sin. And he'd be talking to one guy who happened to be a rapist, and he said, well, at least I wasn't a pedophile. And you might have talked to a murderer and said, well, at least I wasn't an adulterer. It's easy to stand back and look at the outside of stuff. No, I can only see people who are sitting here this morning, and I don't know most of you, and some of you are smiling, some of you aren't smiling, but I don't know what's in your heart. I have no way of knowing. And you have no way of knowing what's in my heart either. But Jesus knows. And he says, get radical with sin. Shut it down. Take a transfer. Take another route. Guard your heart. I met with a guy this summer. And he was a guy that if I had a house to bet, and if I had my kids to offer in the bet, I would have bet the whole thing that he would never, ever stray. And yet here he was. And we heard of the convention, the business convention that he happened to be on. And he met somebody. And the next thing you know, his life has changed. Jesus says, cut it out. Cut it off. Make a change. Live differently. You see, Jesus' standard for righteousness, it's higher. And his solution for the sin of lust, it's harder because you have to be radical. But the consequences are greater than we can ever bear. What does he say? If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. I love what the Message says. It says this, let's not pretend this is easier than it really is. If you want to live a morally pure life, here's what you have to do. You have to blind your right eye the moment you catch it in a lustful leer. You have to choose to live one-eyed or be dumped on a moral trash pile. You see, we have to make decisions in all of this based on eternity rather than based on the temporary. Years ago, I put together a list, and it was inspired by a friend of mine who was speaking. And it's a list entitled, What's at Stake? Now, you can't pull this list out when you're in bed with somebody. This is a list that you read over in the quiet times of sanity. It's not a list that you pull out when the motor is already turned on and it's revving high. You're cooked. Unless you flee and run. This is what's at stake for me. Maybe if you want to live differently, you go home and you create your own list. Number one, I would destroy 35 years of love and trust and history with my wife. I could just stop right there. But it's not just your wife that's involved. I would lose respect of my 3 children. Number 3, my words would be forever suspect from this point on in their lives. Do you imagine trying to tell your adult 3 children that it's important to be faithful to your spouse when you haven't been faithful? Oh, man. Really, really hard. I have observed this happening as I've walked with people who have strayed off the course, who haven't cut it out and cut it off in time. It's sad and it's difficult. I would damage the model of a loving, trusting relationship for my children to replicate in their future relationships. Number 5, I would discredit my Christian faith in the eyes of my neighbors, friends, and clients. Can you imagine? People know I'm a bivocational guy, have been more so in the past, but, there's the guy who played around on his wife, but he's preaching, wow, that doesn't connect with somebody that doesn't know Christ, because they already know the biggest barrier to making a connection with people who are not Christians is hypocrisy. We got to lead the way. If you want to live different, then have things that stand out to people. You have discussions and you go, oh, no, I can't go there. Oh, no, I don't watch that show. No, I'm not going to watch Game of Thrones. I know it's over, but boy, you got to question all of us and we now have Netflix, we have Apple TV, and Amazon Prime. There's a lot of opportunity to get off the wayside, and I realize that one of the things that I want to do in 2020 to live differently is to be more selective in what I allow and not make excuses all the time. About, it's just like we'll fast forward or what. No, maybe we should just say no. Maybe that's what we need to do. Number 6, I would violate the 5 generations of Christian witness, which is my heritage. My grandpa got on a boat and went to Japan, taught himself Greek and Hebrew, and learned Japanese so that he could minister to people. My mom was born in Japan, for crying out loud. I have a rich heritage. My dad was a pastor. My brother is a pastor. If I move off the mark, if I stray, if I let my eyes linger, and if I move to the actual act of adultery, or if I get caught up in other stuff, I am ruining a testimony that God has allowed me to participate. Number 7, I would humiliate my wife. I've been walking with people who are trying to sort out after they've made some seriously wrong decisions. And the humiliation, the shame, the sadness, oh my goodness, I would rather cut off my arm and pluck out my eye than live through that. Number 8, with one fell swoop, I would destroy the Christian example I have been for 35 plus years to my wife's unbelieving family. Number 9, I would become another statistic of one who gave into self as opposed to upholding God's standards. Number 10, my son would have no model of how to be a godly husband and a father. My son and your son and every son and every daughter out there is being exposed to stuff that we would never dream of, to take them off the path. And I don't need to be the dad who wrecks the modeling for him. Number 11, my children would carry into their future the uncertainty of permanence. You see, when you linger lustfully, and whether you're a man or a woman, and you move into that next step, and all things start to break apart and unravel and uncouple, that leaves shaky ground for your kids. They wonder if it's even possible to have a relationship. You know, my parents, my mom's 95, and my dad passed away when he was 73, so she's been on her own for a long time. But they had a happy marriage. And, I married into a family where my wife's parents were happily married. They are role models, even though they didn't know the Lord. My mother-in-law did, my father-in-law didn't. But they were happily married and faithful to one another. Number 12, this is what's at stake. And this is not just for me, it's for each and every one of you. I would sin against God. I would sin against God. Living differently is very, very hard. I'm 61. I know I look about 45, but I am 61. And so I've been around the block more than a few times. And I've walked with friends. And as time goes on, like I was explaining earlier, I'm beyond the place of being surprised. And this summer, hearing about this friend of ours who had strayed in his marriage, and I thought that could never be possible for this guy. I've seen it. I've seen it all. And if we don't make some decisions, the enemy will make inroads in our lives. Now, as I was unpacking this passage and thinking about it and realizing, like, Jesus gives this solution about plucking out the eye and cutting off the hand, and really, that solution in and of itself, it doesn't work. Because you have a left eye, as I said, you still have a left hand, and you have the imagination. And I think what Jesus ultimately is doing in this passage, he's saying, yeah, you've got to be radical. You've got to cut some things out of your life. You have to do that. But listen, at the end of the day, all of this stuff in the Beatitudes, all of this on the Sermon on the Mount, it's a loud, loud call. And the call is, you can't be righteous by the stuff that you do. Your righteousness is only found through Jesus. And so I think what he's trying to communicate is, wow, this is so hard. I'm not a murderer, but I do have anger. There's people that I actually don't like. Guilty. I'm not an adulterer, but whoa, go buy those big, massive pictures with big hair, and then what are you going to do? Jesus, what he's trying to communicate, he's trying to say, we need him. He becomes our righteousness. And that's why he begins this whole big thing, the Sermon on the Mount. He says, what does he say? He opened up his mouth and he taught them, saying in verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What does it mean to be poor in spirit? It means you can't come to God with anything. You can't say, well, God, gee, let me in. I did this, and this, and I was a pretty good guy too. Nice dad, nice husband, nice friend. No, Jesus is saying, you come to me empty-handed, and you partner with me. You see, at the end of the day, what's really important is that you see the cost. I mean, if I told you, let's suppose, hypothetically, that someone in this room is struggling as a Christian with pornography. And I have the conversation in the donut shop where the head goes down, and I say, hey, even before you say anything, I know what your problem is. I've talked to 100 guys, the same problem over and over and over again. If I gave you $1 million, or had $1 million, and I said, okay, be clean for 6 months. I'll tell you what, I think every last guy would be clean for 6 months. They want the $1 million. What Jesus is saying, it's not $1 million offer. The offer is eternal life. The offer is peace with God. And we need to put it in perspective. All of this stuff that we're exposed to, we've got to say no. We've got to shut it down. We've got to move on. And we've got to beg God to be in our life. And we've got to beat back the devil, the enemy, who is so quick and ready. You know what? I think I told you last time, maybe this little sign, I'm going to end with this, 11:15. I think it's been 25 minutes, right, Elise? Listen, in my room, above my light switch and master bedroom, and on my computer too. Be sober, be vigilant, because there is an adversary who's out there ready to pounce on you. He's not there to just give you a back massage. Listen, friends, the enemy wants to seek and destroy all that is good. And in order to live differently, we have to partner with Jesus and understand we get radical with sin. But at the end of the day, we come to God as poor in spirit people, longing that He would partner with us. And that we would see that eternity and holiness is way better than $1 million. It's way better than anything that I could tempt you with so that you would cut it out. That relationship and that deep, abiding presence of God can be ours. He wants us all to live differently. So remember, God's standard is higher. It's higher than anything that we could ever accomplish, and it begins in your heart. Let's leave here today living differently. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word, the richness of it. I thank you for that day so many years ago when you gathered your people around and spoke truth to them and communicated with them that it's only by your righteousness that we stand. By the fact that you died on the cross and rose again. That's our hope. And so I pray for all of these people, some of whom I know and many I don't. But God, I'm certain that in this room, adultery has had inroads. And I pray for those who stand guilty of actually transgressing your law. And may they leave here with hope, knowing that there is no sin that cannot be forgiven. And there is no relationship that cannot be mended. God, I pray for those that sit here in sadness, knowing that their relationships aren't right. And I pray that you would flood them with a hope, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that when the God of the universe enters in, things can change. And things that were broken can be made new. That's what you do your best work in, Lord. So may we leave here encouraged and ready to live differently. I pray in your name. Amen.